Ever feel like you're like right there on the verge of something incredible? Like you can almost like taste it,
Yeah.
but then you kind of trip over your own feet.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of where the Israelites find themselves in Exodus chapter 33.
Okay.
Promised land is like right there, freedom from slavery.
Yeah.
You'd think they'd be ecstatic,
Yeah, you would think.
but things get complicated,
They do.
to say the least.
It's a fascinating chapter, really.
Yeah.
It grapples with this whole tension between human, like, fallibility and then divine grace.
We've got God initially like hesitant to travel with them.
Right.
Moses setting up a tabernacle outside the camp. It's giving timeout vibes for sure.
For sure.
And then there's this whole encounter where Moses asks to see God's face.
Yeah.
And that gets really interesting.
We will definitely get to that.
Okay.
But first, let's unpack this whole God's reluctance thing. Why this sudden hesitation to go to the promised land?
Right.
I mean, he did, after all, make a
Yeah,
promise.
exactly. It feels like a bit of a mixed message.
Well, if we look closely at verses 3 and 5, God describes the Israelites as stiff-necked.
Stiff-necked. Yeah.
Not exactly a term of endearment.
Okay. Help me out here. What does that even mean in this context?
Think stubborn.
Okay.
Inflexible, resistant to change, even when that change is for their own good.
So they're being offered this incredible gift, this land flowing with milk and honey,
Yeah,
but they're too busy digging their heels in to actually receive it.
precisely. And it's not just about being stubborn in general, it's about their relationship with God. Remember the golden calf incident back in chapter 32?
Oh, yeah. That whole let's make a statue and party while Moses is away getting the 10 Commandments fiasco.
Yeah.
Not their finest moment.
Right, that episode highlights their tendency to stray from God's guidance.
Mm-hmm.
They know God has chosen them, has delivered them from slavery,
Right.
but they keep falling back on old habits, old ways of thinking.
Yeah.
This stiff-neckedness is a real obstacle to their growth. Their ability to fully embrace the covenant with God.
It's like they're experiencing some serious cognitive dissonance.
Hmm.
They believe one thing, but their actions keep contradicting that belief.
What's fascinating here is that this isn't just some ancient problem.
Yeah.
We all struggle with this to some extent.
Oh, for sure.
How often do we know what's good for us, what we should do,
Yep.
but then find ourselves making choices that totally undermine our own well-being?
All the time.
Yeah.
It's like knowing I should eat healthy, but then reaching for the bag of chips instead.
Exactly. So God's reluctance to go with them isn't just about punishment or anger.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that their hearts, their minds aren't quite aligned yet with the journey ahead.
Yeah.
They need to work through this internal conflict before they can truly thrive in the promised land.
That makes a lot more sense. It's not just about the destination. It's about their internal state,
Yeah.
their readiness to receive what God has promised.
Right.
So then where does the tabernacle outside the camp fit into all of this?
That's where it gets really intriguing. What strikes you about this detail?
Well, on the surface, it's presented as like a practical thing, a temporary structure for worship and settling disputes.
Mm-hmm.
But it feels symbolic too, right? Like a physical manifestation of the distance between God and the Israelites.
That's a really perceptive reading. It's almost as if this physical separation mirrors the spiritual disconnect they're experiencing. God isn't abandoning them,
Right.
but he's also not fully dwelling among them in the way he did say during their journey through the wilderness with the pillar of cloud and fire.
So it's a consequence of their actions,
Yeah.
but also maybe a chance for them to reflect,
Yeah.
to do some soul searching.
Yeah, to kind of reset.
Like, wait, things aren't working as they should.
Right.
We need to figure out how to bridge this gap.
It raises the question, what does it take to rebuild that sense of closeness, that intimacy with the divine?
Yeah.
And that, I think, sets the stage beautifully for Moses's bold request. He's not just going to sit there and accept this distance passively.
Right? He goes straight to the source and basically says, look, if your presence doesn't go with us, we're no different than any other nation wandering around in the desert.
That line always strikes me. It highlights Moses's profound understanding of what truly sets the Israelites apart.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about land ownership or military might. It's about this unique relationship with God, this
Right.
covenantal bond that defines their very identity.
He's got his priorities straight, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And the way he phrases it in verses 15 and 16, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. It's almost like an ultimatum,
Yeah.
but delivered with such conviction, such desperation. He
Right.
gets it. Without God, the journey is meaningless.
Exactly. And it's interesting to contrast this with the Israelites' behavior.
Okay.
They're focused on the external, the promised land, the spoils of victory,
Right.
while Moses is laser focused on the internal,
Yeah.
on maintaining that vital connection with the divine. He understands that everything else flows from that relationship.
Which makes me wonder, does God's initial reluctance serve as a wake-up call? Is he hoping to draw out this kind of response from Moses? This passionate plea that reveals a deeper understanding of what's at stake?
That's a fascinating question. It certainly suggests that true leadership isn't about blindly following a set of rules or pursuing external rewards,
Right.
but about recognizing the core values, the spiritual essence that should guide every decision, every action. And sometimes that requires pushing back, challenging the status quo, even if it means confronting the divine.
Wow. Okay. Now, I'm really curious to see how this all plays out with Moses' request to see God's face. Because if I remember correctly, things get a bit complicated.
Complicated is one way to put it. Let's dive into that next. It's a passage that has sparked centuries of debate and interpretation. And it's a great example of how even the most familiar biblical stories can reveal new layers of meaning when we dig a little deeper.
Okay, so we're at this point where Moses is essentially like begging God to stay with the Israelites, arguing that their unique relationship is what sets them apart. And then he takes it a step further. He asks to see God's glory.
It's a bold request, almost audacious. And you have to remember, this comes right after the golden calf incident,
Right.
when the Israelites' faith was seriously shaky.
Yeah. You'd think Moses would be a little more hesitant, a little more aware of, well, boundaries.
Right.
He's like, hey, I've proven my loyalty. Now let's take this relationship to the next level.
And God's response is, well, it's not a straightforward yes. No one can see my face and live, he says.
Right.
But then he offers this intriguing compromise. Moses can see God's back parts as he passes by.
Hold on, back parts.
Yeah.
It's giving peekaboo with the Almighty.
Right.
I mean, it's a pretty vivid image, right? God places Moses in a cleft of a rock, covers him with his hand as his glory passes by.
Yeah.
It's both powerful and intimate.
The imagery is incredibly evocative. On the one hand, you have this sense of God's awesome power,
Right?
the sheer magnitude of his glory that could like obliterate a human being.
Yeah.
But then there's also this protective gesture, this almost tender act of shielding Moses from the full force of that divine presence.
I hear you, Moses. You want to know me more deeply?
Right.
But there are limits to what you as a human can comprehend right now.
Exactly. And that raises some really interesting questions about the nature of God.
Yeah.
Why this emphasis on the impossibility of seeing God's face directly? What does that tell us about the divine?
The commentary we have suggests it's a merciful display with the fullness of God's glory reserved for a future state.
Yeah.
But that just makes me even more curious.
Yeah.
What's so overwhelming about God's face that it could be fatal?
There are many different interpretations of this passage, but one way to think about it is that God, in his full essence, is beyond human comprehension. Our finite minds simply aren't equipped to grasp the infinite.
Okay.
It's like trying to fit the entire ocean into a teacup.
So seeing God's face could be less about a literal physical act
Yeah.
and more about a complete and total understanding of his being,
Right.
his essence, which is just like incompatible with our current state of being.
That's one way to think about it. It's not that God is inherently dangerous or hostile,
Correct.
but that his sheer awesomeness, his all-encompassing nature would simply overwhelm our limited human capacity.
Okay, so that makes sense in terms of like our brains exploding from too much information.
Right.
But what about Moses speaking to God face to face earlier in Exodus? Was that just a metaphor?
It's a great question, and it highlights the complexity of biblical language.
Yeah.
Some scholars believe that face-to-face in those instances is meant to convey a sense of intimacy, of direct communication, but not necessarily a literal visual encounter.
So it's more about the closeness of their relationship, the open and honest dialogue they have, than about physically seeing each other.
Exactly. And that raises another interesting point. If seeing God's face in its fullness is beyond our human capacity,
Right.
how do we seek to know God?
Right.
Is it about these grand mystical visions? Or is there another way?
Because honestly, that whole seeing God's face thing sounds kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of revelation.
And that's perfectly understandable. I think this encounter with Moses suggests that knowing God is a process, a journey, rather than a single overwhelming event. It's about gradually unveiling layers of understanding,
Hmm.
deepening our relationship with the divine over time.
So it's less about a sudden flash of insight
Right.
and more about cultivating an ongoing connection, learning and growing in our understanding of God throughout our lives.
Precisely. And that learning, that growing can happen in many ways. It can happen through scripture, through prayer, through acts of service, through our interactions with others, even through experiencing the beauty and wonder of the natural world.
It's like maybe God's presence isn't always about these dramatic, earth-shattering moments.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about recognizing those subtle, everyday glimpses of the divine, those moments of grace and awe that weave through our lives.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think it speaks to a truth that's often overlooked.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on these grand displays of power.
Right.
But God is also present in the quiet,
Yeah.
the mundane, the seemingly insignificant moments of our lives.
It's about noticing those small acts of kindness, those
Yeah.
unexpected moments of joy, those synchronicities that make us go, wait, was that?
Exactly. And perhaps that's a more sustainable,
Yeah.
more relatable way to seek God than chasing after these fleeting, potentially overwhelming visions. It's about recognizing the sacred in the ordinary,
Yeah.
the divine spark that exists within ourselves and in the world around us.
Okay, that's actually really comforting.
Yeah.
It feels less intimidating,
Yeah.
more accessible. So if we're shifting from this idea of seeing God's face to a more nuanced understanding of seeking God,
Right.
what does that look like in practice? What are some concrete ways we can cultivate that ongoing connection with the divine?
That's a great question, and it's one that we can explore further as we delve into the implications of this encounter for our own lives today. It's about moving beyond the spectacle and into the substance of faith.
So we've gone from this idea of God's like initial reluctance to go with the Israelites to this fascinating encounter where Moses like asks to see God's face
Yeah.
and is met with this sort of divine, you're not ready for that yet response.
And it's not a rejection. It's
Yeah.
more of a redirection. It's like God is saying, look, Moses, your heart is in the right place. You yearn for that deeper connection.
Yeah.
But seeking me isn't about forcing a grand revelation.
Right.
It's about cultivating a relationship,
Yeah.
a way of being.
It makes me think about how often we in our own lives seek these like dramatic signs, these big flashing neon confirmations from the universe,
Yeah.
when maybe God's presence is already all around us,
Right.
woven into the fabric of our everyday experiences.
It's like we're so focused on the destination that we miss the beauty of the journey itself. We want the mountaintop experience.
Yeah.
But we forget that the climb, with all its challenges and moments of awe, is where the real transformation happens.
And maybe that's what Exodus 33 is ultimately about.
Yeah.
Recognizing that seeking God isn't about achieving some kind of spiritual checklist.
Right.
It's about an ongoing process of opening ourselves to His presence in all its forms, both the grand and the subtle.
And that process, that opening ourselves, can take so many forms. It can be through prayer meditation, spending time in nature, engaging in acts of service, deepening our relationships with others. It's about aligning our actions, our thoughts, our very being with those qualities that reflect the divine love, compassion, justice, creativity.
So instead of asking, where is God?
Right.
Maybe the question becomes, how can I be a conduit for God's presence in the world? How can I reflect those divine qualities in my interactions, in my choices, in the way I move through life?
And that's a really empowering shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
It moves us from a place of passivity, of waiting for God to reveal himself, to a place of agency, of actively embodying those values, those principles that we believe in.
It becomes less about seeking proof of God's existence
Yeah.
and more about living in a way that reflects His presence,
Right.
that radiates His love and grace outward.
And that, I think, is a challenge that's relevant to all of us, regardless of our religious beliefs or spiritual background.
For sure.
How can we live in a way that brings more light, more kindness, more understanding into the world? How can we be forces for good, for healing, for connection?
It's almost like we each have a little piece of God's glory within us, a spark of the divine.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to nurture that spark, to let it shine outward, to illuminate the path, not just for ourselves, but for others as well.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it brings us back to Moses' request to see God's face. Maybe in a way we are all called to reflect God's face to the world, to embody those qualities that inspire awe, wonder, and love.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Exodus 33, I think the key takeaway is this.
Yeah.
Seeking God isn't about a singular event.
Right.
It's about a lifetime of aligning ourselves with His presence, both within us and in the world around us.
And that alignment, that process of becoming more reflective of the divine, is where the real journey of faith, the real adventure, begins.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder this.
Mm.
How might you be reflecting God's glory in your life? What choices can you make today, right now, that bring you more into alignment with those divine qualities you aspire to? It's a question worth sitting with, a journey worth taking. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep